Thank you, Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and members of the committee for inviting me to speak on leveraging the tax code for infrastructure investment and discuss the importance of community development and renewable energy tax incentives in achieving many of the goals of infrastructure investment. My name is Michael Novogradac. I am the managing partner of Novogradac Company, a national professional services firm with a major focus in the affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and renewable energy sectors. As you look to advance legislation to spur investment in infrastructure, we urge you to include the expansion and enhancement of existing tax code provisions that do just that, as well as consider adding additional community development tax credit tools. The low-income housing tax credit, new markets tax credit, historic tax credit, and renewable energy tax credits are proven public-private partnership infrastructure incentives. They have strong bipartisan bicameral support. These public-private tax credit structures are based on taxpayers investing equity capital up front while tax benefits are claimed and retained over time, to the extent activities continue to provide the benefits the credits were intended to support. The public-private tax credit model embodies the concept of pay-for success. The low-income housing tax credit is an excellent example of this model, having financed more than 3.5 million affordable rental homes and generated 5.5 million jobs. And these accomplishments are the result of bipartisan bicameral support. And we greatly appreciate the establishment of the 4% floor and the $1.25 billion in disaster housing credit allocations that Congress passed last year. However, unfortunately, the country still faces a growing affordable housing crisis. We commend the leadership of Representatives Delbeni, Walorski, Beyer, and Winstrup on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, which would significantly address that crisis by financing as many as 2 million additional affordable homes or more. Now, the Middle Income Housing Tax Credit and Neighborhood Homes Investment Act represent promising new affordable housing tools. The Middle Income Housing Tax Credit would address the needs of renters just above the housing credit income limits, and the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, introduced by Representative Higgins and supported by Representative Kelly, would incentivize single-family housing development in distressed areas. And focusing on community development needs beyond housing, the New Market Tax Credit has been used to provide $110 billion in financing to more than 7,000 businesses and more than 1 million jobs in distressed areas. We do thank Congress for the 5-year extension of this important resource at $5 billion annually. Despite this extension, COVID-19 has exacerbated a tremendous unmet need for private capital in low-income communities. To that end, we do commend Representatives Sewell, Reed, and Jason Smith for addressing this need by introducing the New Markets Tax Credit Extension Act. We also applaud Representatives Sewell and Jason Smith for introducing the Rural Jobs Act yesterday that would incentivize greater new market tax credit investment in rural areas. Now, the historic tax credit is a 20% tax credit that spurred the rehabilitation and preservation of historic structures in urban, suburban, and rural small-town communities. And the National Park Service estimates that the historic tax credit has leveraged more than $100 billion in private investments and created nearly 3 million jobs. Despite this impressive record, the historic tax credit is challenged by COVID-19 issues as well. And we commend the introduction by Representative Blumenauer, LaHood, Sewell, and Higgins of the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, which would address these issues and make some long-needed statutory improvements. We also note a related proposal, the Rehab Act, which was introduced by Representative Blumenauer and supported by Representative Kelly. The Rehab Act addresses the challenges many communities face seeking to renovate older, dilapidated, non-historic buildings by providing a 15% tax credit for such buildings near public transportation. And turning to renewable energy tax credits play a critical role in expanding the use of clean energy in order to combat climate change. And we do applaud Chairman Thompson and Neal for their leadership on renewable energy tax incentives, which led to the enactment of key extensions and enhancements last December. These provisions have helped protect the advancements made to date in clean energy. And while we applaud the above extensions and enhancements, additional tax credit extensions and incentives as envisioned in the Green Act are needed in order to address the clean energy objectives and help stop the worst consequences of climate change. Chairman Neal, Ranking Member Brady, and members of the committee, thank you again for inviting me here to testify today on the importance of leveraging the tax code to increase meaningful infrastructure investment. My written testimony contains much more detail on what I've discussed so far, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Novogradac, I understand you have much expertise across a wide range of tax credits that we are discussing this morning. While their mechanics and goals may be different, one thing we hear almost universally is that taxpayers accessing these credits need certainty and stability to make the most impactful investments. Could you elaborate on the need for certainty and longer-term horizons for community development and green energy tax incentives?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Neal. Thank you for that question, because that is the number one request we get from all of our clients, which is how can we bring more certainty to those incentives that don't have an adequate degree of certainty. The whole concept of a tax credit public-private partnership is using that tax credit incentive to raise capital to further a development. And when you have a short-term incentive, you can't access the equity markets because they will not know that the incentive is going to be available. And that, as such, you don't get as much impact as you otherwise would receive. And the 45 CAP-L credit is an example of one of those credits where it expires at the end of this year and you have to place the property in service this year, which makes it challenging to raise equity capital based upon that, whereas a longer extension of that credit, a longer extension of new markets and various other green energy technologies would lead to greater capital investment in the areas that Congress is intending to incentivize through those credits.
Mr. Novograd, I want to thank you for your long-time leadership, advocacy, and practice in the tax credit utilization for affordable housing and strategic investment. You've been a very important leader. And I appreciate your referencing the reform that I've developed in terms of the historic tax credit and attempting to break new ground with the Rehab Act. I would suggest that your testimony ought to be required reading because it goes into very rich detail on all of these elements. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind elaborating, as you did in your testimony, a little bit about the benefits of being able, in terms of carbon, jobs, energy efficiency, to be able to do a better job of utilizing existing buildings with the historic tax credit, and the concept of the Rehab Act to make it easier to extend that to properties that are adjacent to transit.
Great, thank you, Representative Blumenauer, and thank you for those kind comments. And I do commend you, we commend you for your efforts on the Historic Tax Credit Growth and Opportunity Act, as well as the Rehab Act. There's nothing more environmentally sound than preserving existing buildings, and your Historic Tax Credit, your HCC GO Act would help do that a lot more. I also would note that many historic developers in the course of this pandemic have been challenged by the pandemic, as we all have as a country. And there was a brief survey by the Historic Tax Credit Coalition that showed roughly 2/3 of those properties had more than 50% increase in cost, 90% more than 25%. So I did want to thank you for the HCC GO Act, and that act would increase the tax credit to 30% for a few years to help cover some of those additional costs, as well as eliminate basis adjustments for the historic tax credit, which is important. But also turning to the Rehab Act would help provide incentive to renovate and rehabilitate buildings that are within a proximity of transit that otherwise would stay there dilapidated or be demolished. And that credit, as you know, would help offset some of the added development costs of rehabilitating in those areas. And I would note that around public infrastructure, these types of incentives are needed because for existing buildings, generally speaking, if you're going to save that building, you're obviously stuck with the existing space and structure of the building, which can lead to slightly lower rental income from that property, and you end up with greater development costs. So that's a great incentive that will really build the placement of and the renovation of buildings near public transit.
Thank you very much. I would note, Mr. Chairman, in his testimony, he points out that the investments in these historic renovations produced more revenue, tax revenue, than they cost.
So, Mr. Novogradac, I confess, I loved your testimony and I loved your commitment to all these different things that move forward. And I'm on zero emission buildings, tax credits, hydrogen tax credits, direct air capture, incentivizing the purchase of medium and heavy duty electrical vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. But I still confess I'm fundamentally uncomfortable with tax credits as a measure of public policy. Can you tell me why tax credits are a good idea, that this is really the best tool we have is to tax people and then give them their money right back?
Great, thank you for that question. I'm getting a little feedback.
So I'm sorry.
And that's, I'm not sure where it's caused by, but thank you for that question, because that is a question we get quite a bit as to the use of tax credits. And I sort of go back to the answer to a prior question, is the foundational aspect of tax credits as an incentive is to bring in private equity capital during the higher risk development phase, startup phase of these activities. And to the extent that those activities do get put in place and generate the benefits over time, then that's only when the government pays. It really is a pay for success aspect of the tax code. And what's also important is that pay for success, if there is a problem sometime down the line, that recapture is collectible by the IRS. So I think that pay for success feature, that collectible recapture, is what's led to the success of all the various incentives I've testified to here today.
And one follow-up question. How important is it that these be long-term tax credits and not 1 year at a time? Or how much fun would it be not to have to extend these things every December?
Well, I definitely think not only would it be fun, I'm sure, to not have to extend them every year, but in terms of the value you get out of these incentives, having a long-term incentive that a taxpayer can rely on, that a community development organization can rely on, allows them to put it into their longer-term planning. And it also allows the broader market around these incentives to become more efficient. I will note the low-income housing tax credit, when it was made a permanent part of the tax code back in 1993, it saw a notable increase in value and in pricing, equity pricing, because of that reliability.